Welcome to Mommy Has Questions. Motherhood is hard, but it's even harder when the system is stacked against us. We're four moms who have come together from the big city and the suburbs to call out societal norms that make being a woman feel like a struggle every day, and to spark the change we all need. If you're tired of feeling unsupported and you've got questions, you're not alone. This is your village. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Mommy Has Questions podcast, where one mom's questions become every mom's conversation. I'm Christina, and today we are so lucky to be joined by the most incredible guest. She's a finance expert, a writer, producer. She covers ambition, money, and power in her award-winning newsletter, Too Ambitious, and she is featured on major outlets including Bloomberg, CNBC, and Glamour UK. She truly is a powerhouse, and she is using data to change the culture as we know it. Please welcome Stefanie O'Connell Rodriguez. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi.
And also, your new book is coming out soon, and it's called Ambition Penalty, and so we'll be talking about that a lot today. And last but not least, Stefanie is also a mother herself. Welcome, and thank you so much for being an incredible voice to advocate for women.
Well, thank you for including my voice in your conversation. I love it.
Absolutely. Over here, we're all about using conversations to change the culture. So we actually connected on Instagram because you have this incredible Instagram where truly it's all the data points, and I love data. I'm a public health professional, so data is my jam, and the way that you use it in order to prove your points is exactly what we need. And so you talked on your Instagram and a specific post about moving the goalposts of qualifications, and it really got us thinking just about how deceptive that concept of meritocracy is, because we now live in a society where really women have become more educated than men. We have strived so hard, we work so hard. And so really the question that is going to start off our discussion today is, are women being penalized for their achievements and our success in a world that was predominantly built by men?
Absolutely is the one word answer, but I'll go deeper.
Yes.
So to close gender gaps in pay, in power, in leadership, we have taught generations of girls now to speak up, to fight for what they deserve, to take ownership of their ambitions, while overlooking all of the ways that we as women are still overwhelmingly penalized and punished for doing those very things. So, for example, when women do speak up, the research finds that they are perceived as both less likable and less hireable. And when women do succeed in the workplace, they're more likely to experience negative judgment and backlash from their peers, which can jeopardize their future opportunities for advancement, for equal pay, for equal power. And when women do negotiate, they're less likely than their male counterparts to receive the raises and the promotions they've requested, and more likely to experience backlash for even asking. So it's the sum of these professional, financial, social, and personal costs too that women still face when asking for or pursuing more, that I collectively refer to as the ambition penalty. And that's why the name of the book is The Ambition Penalty. And what's really important about the ambition penalty is that it really challenges the assumption about what actually keeps women from equal opportunity, from equal power and pay. And it dispels these really common myths that, well, the problem is that women just don't ask for more, or they don't seek out leadership opportunities, and they don't really express interest in advancement to the same degree men do. Because what the data actually show is that women enter the workforce with the same or even higher levels of ambition as their male counterparts. The difference is that while men are praised and rewarded for those public and professional ambitions, women are still more likely to be judged and to be punished for acting on theirs.
All of those points just hit so hard, especially talking about the motherhood penalty in all of this, and the ambition penalty, which is defined as the sum of the financial, personal, and professional costs that women face for daring to want more. And dare I say, we were conditioned for this. I mean, as millennial women, I feel like we were just brought up in this age of girl power. You can do everything boys can do. How do you reconcile with this, having grown up in this age where truly we were just told we can do it all? You just have to work hard. You have to follow the path, get educated, get the career, and do all of it. And then when you get to that point and you're like, wait, hold on, I'm still facing all of these inequalities. And when I try to ask because I've been told that I can and I should, I am faced with this penalty for it.
I reconcile with it by first just recognizing the reality. I really grew up firmly entrenched in that girl power culture, earned girl boss culture by the time I entered the workforce. And now I'm going to be 40 next year. So I'm coming into my midlife, my peak earnings years. And the gender pay gap today is in the same place as it was 20 years ago before I started my career. Even as my entire generation is now more educated and ambitious than ever. And every single woman in the workforce today is a woman who entered the workforce since the time women began outpacing men in higher education. So we talk about the fact that women are outpacing men in higher education, and then there's this moral panic about it, like boys are falling behind. There's this very, very common narrative. But this has been true for decades, since before I was born. And yet we are still in a place where women have far less power, far less access to pay, far less access to leadership and opportunity and advancement relative to their male peers. And it goes back to what we were talking about before with that idea of like the myth of meritocracy and how we move the goalposts as women do become more qualified and they do become ambitious. And so I think the education example is a really good way of understanding how these myths of meritocracy work, and it gives us an opportunity to call them out. So the way you preserve the illusion of meritocracy in the face of the reality we're currently in is this moving of the goalposts that you referenced that I've spoken about, which is changing what metrics matter or what metrics are considered important in terms of enabling access to opportunity and advancement. So now that women and people of color are increasingly represented in higher ed, we now see this shift away from prioritizing higher education.
And as mothers, we are trying to have it all. And there is now a lot of statistics that we're being inundated with that are saying mothers are leaving the workforce in droves. So are we being burned actually for trying to have it all?
So women experience these penalties for engaging in the exact same behaviors that are rewarded in men, not because of anything that they are doing differently. It's not that women are trying to have it all and men aren't, but it's because of these gendered double standards that leave women more likely to face backlash for engaging in the same self-advocacy and striving that men, particularly cis and straight and white able-bodied men, can reliably implement to get ahead. So if he's independent, he's a go-getter. If she's independent, she's selfish. If he's ambitious, that's just what we need. And if she's ambitious, it's who does she think she is? If he's assertive, oh, what a great leader. And if she's assertive, whoa, what a bitch, right? And what these double standards effectively do is leave women uniquely disillusioned, uniquely drained, and uniquely demoralized to an extent that men simply aren't. Not because they were striving to do more than their male counterparts, but because they were made to experience that striving very differently. And then what happens is under this illusion of meritocracy, we deny this reality. We deny that women have been held to any kind of different standard. We don't recognize that they've been subjected to completely different treatment or denied very different rewards. And we pretend that their exhaustion and their burnout is just an individual problem of their own making, or maybe a sign of a lack of their commitment and their drive. Women just, they're not as committed to their careers. It must be biological or it's their choices, right? Not really recognizing that women don't have the same choices to make.
I'm so glad you brought that up because you recently talked about in your Instagram was the fallacy of choices that women are presented with. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept of this fallacy of choice that women have?
Yeah. So when we talk about a decision like continuing to work on a certain schedule after you have children. We talk about it like it's experienced in the same way for people across identity, and that's simply not true. When women become mothers, no matter how much they continue to work in the workplace, no matter how committed they maintain themselves in their careers and how many hours overtime they work, they are still less likely to be perceived as committed, as dedicated, and are still far more likely than their male counterparts to experience the motherhood penalty. So hits to their pay, to their opportunities, to their advancement relative to their male peers after they become mothers. So much so that the motherhood penalty is estimated to cost women about, I think it's $500,000 over the
Mhm.
course of their careers. And quite frankly, for women at the upper income level, these penalties are much, much greater because their potential for growth following motherhood is also much greater. But it's also in those higher level roles where there is much less tolerance for women taking the same flexibility that even their male counterparts will take. Women are judged for taking the exact same amount of time as their male peers when it comes to this perception of, oh, is she really committed? Men actually have jobs that do have more flexibility, even though we have this myth making that it's just that women's jobs are more flexible. Oh, it just makes sense that her career falls by the wayside. There is just this litany of talking points that we have on hand that are grounded in false assumptions that are used to justify why inequality makes sense. And it doesn't make sense. And yet we come back to this choice rhetoric. Oh, it's just that she's choosing to
Mhm.
downshift her career. But if men are afforded more flexibility than women, well, then she didn't have the same choices to make. She had to downshift her career because her employer was not willing to grant her the same opportunity as her male counterpart. And the same with pay, right? She didn't have the same choice to continue to grow and advance professionally because she was being penalized at the same time that her male counterpart, when he became a father, was rewarded with greater pay and greater opportunity. So it is not the same choice. And what I say is that, like, pretending that these choices are the same when the way they play out in practice is entirely different is, again, a way of reinforcing this illusion that the playing field is level while finding new ways of enacting the same discrimination.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. And I actually have a quick anecdote from my own life working in the public health field. You would think, there's more quality, you're focused on social services, et cetera. However, at the moment that I became pregnant was like, are you going to be able to handle this? It became this kind of stumbling block to where, oh, she's not going to be able to rise higher. Meanwhile, I had a male counterpart who was becoming a father. And I remember specifically in the workplace where my boss would make concessions to where they'd be like, oh, he needs to bring in more income to his family because he is now a provider. Let's make sure he's getting more opportunities so that he can get further ahead. And it was just this wild notion that nobody really could speak against, because then if you speak up, well, she's being too harsh. She's not advocating for her coworkers, things like that. So it does happen in real life. And I can attest to that personally. It did happen to me. And unfortunately, then we're left to having to take a step back, like so many women are now, leaving the workforce in droves because we are limited in our actual choices that we can make and kind of more pushed out. So, what's your reaction when you see the headlines that are saying, oh, women are leaving the workforce, and that rhetoric that is chosen to portray this narrative?
I think anything that frames this as a freely made choice is incredibly dishonest and incredibly dangerous, because what it's doing is providing cover for what is a very targeted, explicit, and intentional attack on women's economic autonomy, especially Black women, especially mothers of young children. So the most vulnerable among us, economically speaking, and the most important in terms of their economic security being essential to supporting the next generation, because these are the people who are most likely to be the caretakers. And it's pretty wild to me that women's caretaking responsibilities are used as a justification to pay them less, because if anything, that should be a justification to pay them more and to make the workplace work for them and not the other way around.
Yes, that's so right. And do you have any statistics actually offhand about inequality within the household itself? Like here on Mommy Has Questions, we talk about a lot of those gender inequalities that occur within our microenvironments, within our home and stuff. So, can you talk a little bit about how that does translate to what we see in households themselves, and then how those repercussions are faced in the workforce as well?
Sure. So in my book, I break this down in terms of our experiences of these inequalities across gender identity at the interpersonal level. And for most people, they think of this as their household. And we see this very, very clearly in heterosexual relationships and heterosexual households. And then I look at the institutional level. So you're looking at a workplace, but it could also be a community, it could be a school. It's a place where you're talking about like generally institutions and organizations. And then at the third level, I look at the political, the social, the cultural. These are the norms. These are ideas of what a good mother does or what a good dad does, to go back to your notion of the employer saying, well, this man's going to need to provide for his children, as though women don't provide. If anything, women are the providers because
Right.
they are the ones providing both income in the majority of households and care. So men continue to live their lives as though they didn't have children. That's actually what comes up in the data. To go back to this point about the interpersonal, what
Mm.
we see in the data is that following the birth of a child, a man's time use stays almost unchanged. A woman's time use changes drastically. She takes on far more of the caretaking labor. She takes on far more of the household labor. And that comes at the direct expense of her professional life and her economic autonomy. And those declines are not just freely chosen. They are often things that people are pushed into due to the reality of a gender pay gap where a man makes more. And so prioritizing his career makes sense. Or the reality of childcare costs, which are just so burdensome. They cost more than a college education, which you have 18 years to save for in tax advantaged accounts. And suddenly you have a new baby and you need to start funding childcare costs like immediately. You have 9 months to prepare, maybe. So these are household inequalities that are compounded by organizational inequalities like what you experienced in the workplace, which are then compounded by these broader political and social inequalities like not having access to affordable childcare or not having comprehensive maternity and paternity leave. And so
Mm.
I think it's really important to recognize the ways in which all of these things are interconnected and they build upon one another. And one of the most striking things I realized writing my book was just how much inequality outside of the home depends on the inequality within it. It
Mm.
is really striking to see the difference, for example, between married men's income and single men's income. In
Mm.
fact, single men's income, even if you control for things like education and experience, because married men are already more likely to be higher income, but even if you control for those characteristics, married men's incomes are so much higher than anyone else's, and single men's incomes track pretty closely with just about everyone else's. And it shows you just how much that inequality in the workplace and the culture of the workplace, the culture of long hours, the culture of not taking career breaks, the culture of not really accommodating caregiving responsibilities depends on men being able to have access to other people who will do that labor for them.
Wow, that really hits hard because it's so true, and I've experienced it in my own life. This image it brings to me is, I think we might have all seen it lately, where there was this poll recently done comparing men and women and what they need in order to feel success and happiness. And I believe men, what disproportionately they wanted to feel success was to have a household, a family, etc. Whereas for women, it was way down the totem pole, which makes total sense based on what you're saying. This inequality benefits men so much more. Tiff, you know how we're all busy moms carrying a mental load that feels like 12 tabs open on Google? And then your kid does something so cute that you want to freeze it forever, not just as a photo, but actually capturing the moment.
I know exactly what you mean. And sometimes you want to capture more than just a photo. You want to capture what is truly happening in the moment and not forget the meaning behind the photo.
Well, now there's an app to do exactly that. Poppy is the beautifully designed photo app that lets you add voice notes to your photos so you can tell the story behind the smile in seconds.
Yep. Now you can capture the moments that matter effortlessly with Poppy, the voice note memory app for modern moms. Download on iOS or tap our show notes and use our promo code Mommy Has Poppy for 3 months free at checkout.
Getting back into one of our questions, something we talk about a lot as well here is invisible labor. Can you talk a little bit about, based on some of your data points, your research that you've done in your book, like how are men benefiting from this invisible labor that women are putting forth?
Yeah, so just to give us a little bit of a definition about what invisible labor is, this is everything from housework, cooking, cleaning, the daily activities of managing a household to care work, childcare, elder care, kin keeping. So maintaining friendships, organizing parties. If you've ever been to like a wedding with your husband, you probably were the one who bought the gift, even if it was his friend, right? This is like
Mhm.
this kind
Yeah.
of extra emotional labor and mental labor and cognitive labor along those lines. It's also all of the administrative work and mental work of keeping track of the kids' doctor's appointments and the kids'
Mhm.
teachers and when everything needs to happen. If they're going to summer camp, do you have to sign up in January? And if you miss the deadline, what happens, right? So this is incredibly important work that literally the whole world depends upon to continue functioning, and yet it's incredibly undervalued both socially and materially. We say that we value motherhood, but it's really rhetoric, right? There is a
Mhm.
performance of a kind of ideal of motherhood that we value, but we don't materially value this labor. This is labor that is largely uncompensated, and I think what is under recognized is that it's not just uncompensated labor, but it actually subsidizes the earnings of men. In the
Mhm.
data, we see this. I'm going to quote a paper here. It says women's non market work increases their partner's earnings while decreasing their own earnings. So it's not only something that takes away from women's own capacity to engage in their personal and professional ambitions full time or to the extent that they'd like to, it also directly subsidizes the energy, ambitions, and finances of men. And I would also note that this isn't just a money thing, it's also a leisure thing. So, one
Mhm.
of the things we don't talk about a lot is the gender leisure gap. Uh, Men have significantly more leisure time than women. And we've talked a little bit about burnout, but I think burnout has become this huge cultural flashpoint to justify a lot of the attacks on women's economic autonomy, their professional
Mhm.
ambition. It said, hey, you girl boss too close to the sun and now you're burned out. No wonder.
Yeah.
But the truth is, men have more access to paid labor, to professional power, to public power, and yet they have much more leisure than women. So, paid work is not the barrier here. The barrier here is the systems we talked about that hold women to a different standard, the systems that constrain the choices women have available to them, and then these dynamics that are happening in the home where women are so overworked at their own expense, at the expense of their well-being, at the expense of their time, their time for rest, replenishment, and their financial prospects, their professional prospects. And not only that, but we see in the data that this directly enables men to have more leisure and more rewards professionally, financially of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see it all the time. And what you just talked about, this leisure gap, one thing that I've been seeing in this rhetoric that has been going around in the media is pushing this return to a soft life of simplicity for women, not for
Mm.
men, but just for women. It's probably part of the ambition penalty. You're, like you said, we're girl boss too close to the sun. You've burned out too hard. It's okay. Come back to us. Have this beautiful, soft, traditional life and things will be okay. How do you tell women, what the realities are of that?
First of all, the essential premise of these trends, especially the more you lean toward the trad wife of it, is the idea that if you just give up your
Mhm.
professional life, or if you lean away from it, either a little bit, if you're like just toying with a soft life, or like fully, if you're fully immersed in the trad wife life, where the vision is if you just devote yourself to your husband and your children exclusively, then you will unlock this sense of freedom and peace and security. But the idea that working nonstop to care for your household is somehow in any way easy, freeing, not hard work
Mhm.
is a lie. It's just plainly a lie. We know that that is an incredible amount of work. So, what we're talking about is not giving up work, we're talking about giving up compensation. And I think
Mhm.
that's a really important distinction to make. And what happens when you give up compensation is you give up a lot of personal power and autonomy, and you're at far greater risk unless you have a lot of protections in place, or you really are in an equitable partnership, or you have a real social safety net so that should you need to get out of your situation, you have the ability to do so. But it's more than just like selling a lie. It's also really using this language of, it's just that you were too ambitious, you were hustling too hard, to obfuscate the fact that this is a distinctly gendered phenomenon happening here. All of these trends, they all lean into a very specific vision of what femininity is, right?
Mhm.
We're not talking about rejecting hustle culture or changing the workplace. We're not talking about universal basic income here, right? We're not talking about universal health care. These are not people who are advocating for things that would actually make people more secure, more free, less burnt out. We are talking about retreating into a vision of femininity to get those things. And not only is that an illusion, but it's also incredibly dangerous, and it totally ignores the way this is such a gendered conversation, right? We're just saying, well, actually, it's just ambition that sucks. And if we gave that up, we'd unlock everything. And yet, no one is telling men that, right?
Mhm.
So, a lot of the time, this gets couched in all of these different ways. And we overlook like the distinctly gendered notion of it. Even when we talk about something like a progressive ideal, like to value care work, right? These trends pretend to
Mhm.
value care work, but they don't. They value a gendered division of labor where men have the power and women do the labor to support it. If you valued care work, you would meaningfully support mothers, but that is not what these people are advocating for. And these trends really trade on real problems that we all experience. But then they come in with these incredibly dishonest and these incredibly dangerous solutions that not only leave the systems that subject women to so much more burnout to begin with in place, but they put them in a position that is going to leave them even more burnt out than before.
Mm. Yes. That's so true. Well, this has given me so much to think about, and I know it will give our listeners so much to think about. But one thing I want to really focus on as we wrap up our conversation is thinking about a best path forward for women. How can we work to change the narrative, change the culture, and really avoid the ambition penalty in our lives?
So, my book, The Ambition Penalty, is about really laying out the way the ambition penalty works and then asking not what women can do to avoid it, but rather how do we dismantle these structures that continue to subject women to it? Because again, this isn't about something that women can individually choose their way out of or like out hack. And even if you like aren't subject to the ambition penalty in one instance, the chances are that you are going to be subjected to it at a later date. Not because, again, of something that you individually did or didn't do differently, but because what creates it is not something that's about you. It's about how the environment responds to you and how it responds to you differently than your more privileged peers. So, and this is especially true for the women at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, right?
Mhm.
It's not about getting stuck in this trap that we have been in for these last 10 to 20 years of internalizing the responsibility for every problem, where we're like, okay, well, I guess I just didn't power pose enough, or I used too many of the word like just in my emails, or I should just stop
Mhm.
saying sorry, or I'm like using too many exclamation points, right? It's not that. It is not your responsibility, right? This is about turning our framework for what it means to be empowered from an internal thing to an external thing, and recognizing that the biggest barriers between you and opportunity as a woman, and especially for someone who's, again, the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, is not like something that's happening from within you, but it's experienced in the world around you. And the best way to combat those barriers is to not do it alone. You have to start recognizing these things that you're experiencing, these biases, these barriers, this discrimination, this moving of the goalposts, as not internal and not individual, but a collective problem that is being experienced by so many women. And a collective problem requires a collective solution. So in my book, I lay out in every chapter some of those collective solutions. As an example, so often when we talk about equal pay, the conversation turns back to the individualism of negotiation. And I do a whole breakdown in the book of what is flawed about that advice. The ambition penalty plays a huge role. Women do ask for more, they're less likely to get it, more likely to be penalized for asking. So instead of doubling down on that individualism that has kept the gender pay gap in place for the last 20 years,
Mhm.
and is really not moving our metrics forward
Nope.
collectively in any meaningful way. Let's talk about some policies that we know work. How do we organize together to
Mhm.
create more salary transparency? Whether that's on a micro level, just with my coworkers, with other women, whether it's in my workplace, my community, whether it's in my industry more broadly, sharing information, whether it's on a policy level and a state level. A lot of states have passed trade pay transparency laws.
Mm.
Countries have passed pay transparency laws. These are not laws that say you have to close your gender pay gap. They require you to just disclose what you pay people, and yet they close gender pay gaps. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Recognizing that the flaw is not in you, but it's in your environment. And so,
Mm.
how do you work with others to shift that environment? And again, we always talk about these things of like, oh, it's systemic. There's nothing I can do. That feels so
Mhm.
disempowering. But it's not that, right? The system works at every level. Remember, it's
Mhm.
interpersonal, it's organizational, institutional, and it's political and social and cultural. And all three of those things work together. So yeah, while you're voting for the policies that you want to see in place or organizing on behalf of them at the political level, at the small level, right? Like with your girlfriend, you can be
Mhm.
doing that same work.
That was truly inspirational and honestly really drives home what we are trying to do with mothers in our communities, which is really bring awareness to these issues about these gender inequities that occur and really start the conversations so that women can feel like, hey, you can also make a change within your own community.
Absolutely. I think the conversations are really important, but there's a key element of having these conversations I do want to call out because there is a trap that we can get into, and that is this idea that anything that we choose to do is inherently empowering or feminist
Mhm.
just because we are women doing it. And the key here is to get away from thinking about these things individually, whatever it is we're talking about, whether, it's what you have access to in the workplace or what's happening for you in the home. We want to get out of personalizing the problem, and we want to start recontextualizing what we're experiencing into the collective experience of all women. So, how does whatever choice I'm making either expand and support or penalize and constrain the choices of other women? A choice is not actually empowering, even if you call it individually empowering, if it ultimately takes power away from women collectively or enables and reinforces the systems that do that. That said, we're all compromised under the status quo. Yeah, I'm sitting here wearing makeup, for example. And that's a choice that ultimately upholds a beauty standard that makes it hard for some women to access safety and security if they don't uphold the same beauty standard.
Mhm.
So I recognize that, like me wearing makeup, that's part of my coping strategy to get through the reality of being a woman in our
Mhm.
system under patriarchy. And we all adopt some forms of these coping strategies. But what we don't need to do is go ahead and reframe what is like a coping strategy as empowering
Mm.
or feminist. And we don't need to justify the system for being the way it is just because we have to do what we have to do to get through it. So I think we really can and should remain really cognizant of the ways that we're making compromises within
Mhm.
these systems and always reevaluate whether it's something we really should be doing and always considering how we're using our personal power to stand in solidarity and with whom. Are we standing like with the systems of male supremacy that hurt women, or are we actively working and challenging the status quo?
Mm. Yeah, that's a lot to sit with also. It is such a good point to remember that our individual choices are working within a larger system in order to survive within the system. And then within that system, we can navigate ways to create change. So there are ways in which we can do it, but not necessarily everything is going to be that feminist choice of female empowerment. And we have to recognize that. That's so important. Like, I think the work that you are doing in your research, in your advocacy, and specifically now in your book that we can all read come springtime. So excited. So you're going to be giving a lot of takeaways for women. Are there any takeaways that you can provide for men in order to, digest what you're providing in this book to become better allies?
Yeah. So I like to think of these systems as something that we all partake in. A system of power really relies on reinforcement. And so the way these systems of male dominance are reinforced is by shifting rewards and penalties for behaviors when they're expressed by different people. Like if you reward men for being confident and ambitious and aggressive and you penalize women for those things, you essentially create different outcomes. And if you reward women for being more compassionate or submissive or subservient and you penalize men for those things, then you effectively create different outcomes. And this is something that we all partake in, men and women. So I think this is important when we talk about these things to recognize that this isn't about an individual dynamic. Misogyny, sexism, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, all of these things are systems. So we have to always think, what are we doing to either reinforce or dismantle the system? And that's as true for men as it is for women. Any man who wants to really challenge gender inequity and challenge the status quo can really step up in his house today. The great thing about that, like systemic change, is there's literally no barrier to you doing it. If you want to do more to support your spouse in a relationship at home, you can start doing that immediately. There's no excuse. It's really, really important to recognize that these are not things, even if they are systemic, that are some like magical thing in the universe that are beyond our control completely. You can start doing more in your household today. In fact, the most important predictor of your children's gender role attitudes is their father's contributions to the household labor when they're teenagers.
That is a great one. And actually, it is my part of my final question for you because as parents,
Mm.
both mothers and fathers and any caregiver, how can we best prepare this next generation for success?
Yeah, so my baby is not even 2 years old, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on parenting. But again, just to go back to the data, I shared that point about, paternal influences on children's gender attitudes.
Mhm.
It finds that exposure to fathers who take on unpaid labor, both housework and childcare, is associated with more gender egalitarian attitudes by the time those children become adults. It's really important for us to not just be aware of how we talk about these things. I already talked about like reframing things from personal or individual into collective and systemic, but also what are we modeling? What are we showing? That really matters. And I also would love to get away from reinforcing the idea of these like gender difference in a way that's like natural or fixed.
Mhm.
Even if it's well intentioned, even the girls can do anything boys can do, it still reinforces this idea of difference. And I think it's
mhm.
really, really hurting us. And you'll hear people say, my kids, they just do exactly all the stereotypes, even though I try not to be so stereotypical. But I think we are really, really not aware of how gendered our world is, even if we perceive ourselves to be doing things neutrally. The truth is, like, gender reveal parties would not exist if the world were in any way neutral, right? People have strong reactions to that. So I think it's so important to get away from this idea of reinforcing difference and really getting more connected again to the collective. What is our shared experience? Not what is masculine, what is feminine, what is human? Because ultimately what masculinity and femininity does is it's a stereotype that asks you to cut off part of yourself. And today for men, it is telling you to cut off your care, your compassion, and that hurts them. And for women, it is telling you to cut off your ambition, to cut out the competitiveness or the goals you have for yourself outside of marriage and motherhood, and that hurts them. These are not good for anybody. And what it does is it reinforces a system of power that creates these unequal outcomes generation after generation. And if we want to challenge a system, I don't think it's about redefining masculinity or femininity. I think it's about recognizing our shared humanity.
Yes. Oh, man, so beautifully put. It truly is. Because, yeah, sticking us in little boxes and saying you have to be this, you have to be that is not working in gender, in politics, and all these things. So we have to focus on that shared humanity in order to achieve equity. Thank you so much, Stefanie. Like, this was such an illuminating conversation, and we are so, so lucky to have had you and your powerful voice on this podcast, and we cannot wait to share it with everyone. And we cannot wait for everybody to be able to read your book, which is coming out in stores in May of 2026. However, don't forget, everyone, please go ahead and pre-order the book. It is available, and we will have the link in our show notes, and we will send a link to all of our followers on all of the various platforms. So, Stefanie, thank you so, so much. This was such a great conversation.
Yeah, it
And
was a treat.
Thank you. Thank you. And don't forget to follow Stefanie as well. She has amazing data-driven facts that she shares on her platforms as well. So don't forget to catch her, and we will have all of that again linked in the show notes. So thank you. And as always, continuing the conversation is part of the solution. Thanks.
Mommy Has Questions is brought to you by, among other things, a vibrant moms collective that provides in-person programming and online content. For more information, please visit momsamongotherthings.com. This episode was produced by Christina Sansone and directed by Tiffany Hodges, with theme music by Juan Carlos Enriquez. Hit subscribe to catch our next episode and rate and review us to let others join our village.